Good evening. On behalf of Carol and the Kerber family, welcome to the celebration of life for Dan Kerber, Dan the man. My name's Jim Wilmath, and I first met Dan 18 years ago this month when his daughter Kathy hired me to work at the company, which is Kerber Sheet Metal, but you all probably know that. My office was located just directly across from Dan's. We were separated by a hallway. And that was so long ago, I actually had a full head of hair when I started working there. That's a true story, isn't it? I did. And that wasn't the case several years later when Father Time and genetics had caught up to me. And I remember one day I was working at my desk and I was looking down at a blueprint and I heard Dan walk out of his office, but he stopped. I waited a couple seconds and I looked up, and when I did, he's standing right in my doorway. And he takes one hand and he puts it up like this in front of his face. And he turns his head back like this. And I said, Dan, what's wrong? And he got that patented mischievous grin on his face. And he said, you're gonna have to start wearing a hat. And of course, he laughed his ass off at his own jokes the way he always did. So I came to learn that Dan started the business in 1979. Steve and I were talking about this a little earlier. I didn't realize that he was 2 months away from entering the world at that time. But the economy in 79, for those of you that might remember, I'm not really old enough to remember, but we had inflation over 13%. The economy was in a recession. Dan and Carol had 3 kids at home, 1 on the way. Sounds like a great time to start a business. And even in a healthy economy, Dan had a challenge on his hands because 50% of small businesses fail in the first 5 years. The ones that survive make it an average of 8.5 years. So, some of you may know this, but it is more than impressive that 43 years later, the company he founded not only has survived multiple recessions and a global pandemic, but it is thriving. Yeah, it is. It still provides great opportunities for employees and their families, and it still gives back to the local community, both of which were very important to him. Carol and Dan's quiet generosity have enhanced the community we're in, including this very facility we're in right now. So how did he do it? How was he able to defy the odds? He started out making ductwork. So how is it that he comes back from breakfast with some engineers from BF Goodrich one morning, and he tells his shop foreman, we're gonna start making airplane parts. And I was told when Gary heard this, he said, we're gonna make what? But I think I may have found a clue. Here is what one of the Goodrich engineers who worked with Dan in the early days recently said to Kathy. I have fond memories of your dad, his sharp mechanical mind figuring out how to do the impossible. So he starts out by hand cutting heat shields with tin snips. He buys one of the first laser cutters in this region and then begins the journey of what's required for aerospace parts, high precision, not necessarily in ductwork, so it was quite a change. But over 40 years later, the company formerly known as Goodrich, because it's went through a lot of changes, still buys its heat shields from the company that Dan founded. They are on commercial, regional, and defense aircraft, and Dan even made a heat shield that went on the space shuttle. So how else did Dan build a successful company that's now been passed down to another generation? He wasn't willy-nilly about spending money, was he? So a guy in our shop that's been there for some time now, when he first started, he told me this story. I just recently started working at Kerber, and one day I was disposing of some brown craft packaging paper our metal sheets were covered with. Dan asked me what I was doing, and when I told him, he said, "No, don't throw that away. I can use it for wrapping presents." I think Matt thought the same thing, because he thought he was joking. But then Dan had him hop in the dumpster, pull all the craft paper out that he threw away, and put it in a box. So Steve, if the grandkids one Christmas received gifts that looked like they were wrapped at Heron's Meat Market, mystery solved. So in closing, before I bring Dan's brother up here, I just want to leave you with this thought. If you've flown on an airplane over the past, 40 years, there's a good chance the safe landing was assisted by parts made right here in Troy, Ohio, by the company that Mr. Kerber founded. Up next is Dan's brother Fred, who I was told was the eldest, but I think I might have misinterpreted that because he said he's far from the eldest, and Fred Kerber.
Well, I'm glad I talked to you before. Yeah, I'm far from the oldest. I'm ninth in the family, by the way. Good evening. I'm honored to be here today to share about my brother Dan. Ironically, though, Dan was never a part of my early years. He left home for the Catholic seminary in Cincinnati after 8th grade. I was 2 years old. So it wasn't until I was an adult did I know Dan as a brother, the oldest of 12, who greatly influenced our family. Daniel Joseph Patrick Kerber was the son of George and Dorothy Kerber. The Kerbers worked on the railroads in western Ohio during the late 19th century. The Wibkers, our mother's family, were farmers and homesteaders from Mercer County since the early 1800s. As a baby, Dan spent 2 years in San Diego, California during the war. While there, brother Bill was born. After the war, the family made its way back to Sydney, Ohio. They lived on Ross Street, where Dan and Bill welcomed brothers Bob and John. In 1950, the expanding family moved to Spruce Street and grew to include 2 girls, Linda and Nancy, followed by 6 more boys, George, Mike, Fred, Alan, Joe, and Gary. My oldest brothers shared stories that helped me fill in the gaps and appreciate Dan's growing up years. Bill said that Dan just really loved the outdoors. They would go fishing on the Miami River, in the roadside and Toowawa parks with neighborhood friends Dickie Hooker and Carl Barhorst. I had to get Dickie Hooker's name in there. They camped out whenever they got a chance, and one summer when Dan was home from the seminary, he and Bill slept on the back porch every night. Bill also recalls Dan spending many summer hours walking along the B&O and the New York Central Railroad with Dad looking for wild asparagus, strawberries, and black raspberries. Bob remembers sled riding on the Chestnut Street Hill across from the train depot, and on one run, Dan slicing his ear so severely that it was flopping around, and Mom had to take him to the ER. None of the other boys went home with Dan, and they sure heard about it later. Bob also remembers Dan and his friends taking their bikes to the fairgrounds and playing demolition derby on the racetrack, smashing the bikes so severely that they had to carry them home for repairs. John, who can't be here this week, tells the story of Dan as a young adult working for Huffaker Plumbing. He took John under his wing and gave him summer employment. Talking to John this morning, he said, "The money was great, but more importantly, Dan really helped me with my self-confidence." It was truly a gift to John. One amusing story in the family is familiar with us that is of Dan bringing Carol home for dinner early on in their relationship. Carol, an only child, came into the kitchen to ask what she could do to help. My mom handed her a huge family pot of potatoes to mash by hand. The look on Carol's face, "You want me to do what?" But more importantly, that day marked a new beginning for the Kerbers. Our family added a new member. There were a lot of adjustments for all parties, but Dan showed us Kerbers that the world is a lot bigger than our big family. I have come to appreciate Dan's quiet leadership. He left an indelible mark on all of us. Dan loved family and community. He took his role as the eldest seriously, checking in with all of us on holidays and birthdays. When we would talk on the phone or in person, Dan would always ask about a sibling, niece, or nephew from whom he hadn't heard recently. He was responsible, he was dutiful, and he always answered the call of family. My brother Alan and I, for several years, would scramble for a place to hold our annual bachelor party. Dan would always graciously say yes to hosting on his farm yet another year. Dan never forgot commitment of family, faith, and community. As I finish today, I think tenderly of Dan's 4 children, Kathy, Beth, Grant, Stephen. Your dad left an incredible legacy, and each of you are passing that on to future generations in your own unique way. I think of Dan's business acumen, his love of farming and genealogy, his joy of going to farm and estate sales, and his devotion to beekeeping and working with his hands. And I see how he has passed those worthy endeavors to you 4 and your families. And I look at this crowd gathered together today, and I think of Dan's love for community and his graciously giving back to it. In the end, Dan ran the good race. He finished the course. He kept the faith. In summing up, our brother, father, husband, grandfather, uncle, and dear friend, I remember author John Donne's words. He was not of an age, but for all time. Thank you.
Up next to speak is Dan's longtime neighbor and friend, Joe, and I'm going to try not to butcher it, Joe Girolamo. Okay, and I was telling Kathy, I know you guys had quite a few parties together. I would have loved to have heard Dan pronounce your last name after he had a couple beers.
Thanks, Jim. Carol called me earlier this week and asked me to speak here, and I thought she said to speak for 35 minutes, but then Jim explained a little while ago, 3 to 5 minutes, so that's good. We'll just go with that. And some of the things I wanted to say have already been said, and as I was preparing some remarks, a few things stood out. The first one, as I thought about, was Dan was generous. And the other one I thought about was Dan was very intelligent. And third, he was fun. And so I'm going to work on those three themes. Laura and I moved to Troy 36 years ago, January of 1986. And my only concern in my neighborhood was I was buying a house right across the street from a factory, Kerber sheet metal. And I went, I love this house. And this, we'll just see. It's a small factory. It can't be that much trouble. And literally 3 weeks after we moved in, we got invited to the Southwestern Historic District float fundraising party. And we said, okay, we're new, we'll show up. The chairman of the float that year was none other than Kerber. So, boom, we've lived in Troy 3 weeks. We are involved with our neighborhood, with the float, with Carol, and of course, Dan. And Dan was so generous with everything, with the neighborhood. Well, and it's obvious from his obituary, everything in the city of Troy. But, he opened up his shop. That's where we built the float. That's where we did a lot of things. He opened up his truck. He used his trucks. Everybody in the neighborhood used that big box truck. Dan said one day that truck has more miles helping people move than it has moving Kerber sheet metal stuff. And finally, probably behind the scenes, he opened up his checkbook. Carol probably twisted his arm a few times to get some help there. But he was always generous with his time and with everything. And so I got to read my notes here. And let's see. But so Kerber sheet metal became a blessing to live across the street from that. And then the other thing I think about Dan, he was always looking for information. He was researching, and he would come up with this stuff, and he says, you know what I heard? And he starts talking about something that happened in 1815. And I says, no, Dan, I didn't hear that. But please share it. And he loved having the scoop. He snooped around town, around the neighborhood, everywhere. He wanted to be the first person to have some kind of information. And then once he got it, he was not shy about sharing it. He wanted to make sure everybody knew his scoop. But let's see, he loved his scoop. Okay, I got that one. And, well, my wife said, don't say that about him. Okay. And the other thing he shared was the farm, and another generous thing that he did. And he got this farm, and then he invited everybody out there. We had the 4th of July parties, which that is my favorite holiday of the year. And so I grew up with great 4th of July memories as a child. And now as an adult, I have great 4th of July memories out at the Kerber farm. And I remember there was pig roasts and other events. And what most people don't know is how hard Dan worked to get that farm ready. Because a few times I had gone out there the week before or a couple days before. Carol worked very hard too. I saw her out there. And all the preparations they did to make sure everybody had a great time. Again, he was just so generous. And it was so much fun to be out there. And another evolution of things that happened at the farm were the bees. I had wanted to be a beekeeper. And so I needed a place to put the bees. So I asked Dan, can I put a beehive out at the farm? Dan says, of course. And then about 2 weeks later, he says, I don't want to be your landlord. I want to be your partner. And so that was how our little partnership started with beekeeping. And the beekeeping stories, we could go on for hours, but I won't do that. Mostly, there was one event the first time we harvested honey. Dan ended up in the hospital. We really didn't know what we were doing. And they get to the hospital and he's all swollen up, and the doctor says, well, and Dan had hives from 100 bee stings. And the doctor says, well, the first thing we got to do is get rid of these hives. And Dan yells out, I'm not getting rid of my hive. And he was like, no. And so we continued on with the bees. And now the bees have been passed down to Bridget and to Beth. So we have more beekeepers multiplying. And so it's just fun. And that's the other thing, it was just fun being with Dan. And somebody mentioned his inside jokes. And Dan loved having an inside joke. And sometimes they were so inside that he was so with only Dan knew it. And I was like, Dan, it's like, well, okay. And he's laughing his head off. He's having a good time. I was like, you got to explain that to me, Dan. And so he was fun. And he was fun at parties. And he was fun to talk to. Both, he was intelligent. He gave you good stuff to think about. And one last thing, you mentioned he always asked about family and see, then you get that. One of the last times I visited Dan at the facility, he said, how's your son? Carlo, who now lives in Indianapolis, he asked about my son and about my grandchildren. And he wasn't remembering a lot of stuff at that time, but he remembered my son and my grandchildren. And that's Dan all the way to the end. Thank you.
Okay, up next, we'd like to have Mr. Bob Pope come up. Bob is with the Sheet Metal and Roofing Association. We refer to it in the trade as SMACNA, and I think he's had a few travel adventures with Dan.
Well, first, Carol, thanks for letting me have the opportunity to speak. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I've known Dan Kerber since 1979 and had the opportunity to spend time with Dan in both the work environment and social settings. So I've had many occasions to be with Dan over many years. In the business settings, Dan was very well respected. Dan and I have attended meetings together traveling across the country with legislative representatives on both the state and national level, local and national business group meetings, and worked with legal and professional staff on many topics. Dan also served on the board of directors for our industry's national association, the Sheet Metal and Air Conditioning Contractors, and has served on numerous committees at both the national and local level, including being president of the Dayton chapter. Kathy is continuing that tradition of involvement on both the local and national level, and it's appreciated, Kathy. In these situations, Dan was controlled and a calm thinker. He always contributed in a positive way in any meeting we attended and respected and paid close attention when someone else was speaking. I will say this about Dan, sometimes when I might be going down the wrong track in the meeting, he would kind of look over at me and just kind of go like this. That was his signal to me. And I always appreciated it. I always looked to Dan for bouncing things off of him and getting his ideas. I respected him very much. I think this is most likely the Dan Kerber that most of you knew as well. Now, I would like to talk to you about a couple of areas where you might be surprised about Dan. One area is athletics in golf and track. I know that sounds unbelievable, but I'll tie it together, I promise. I am not sure how athletic Dan was overall. But early in our acquaintance, I invited Dan to play in a local golf outing that I needed another person to fill our foursome. Dan was very hesitant, but I explained to him that I was not a good golfer and I would feel more comfortable playing with somebody I knew rather than a stranger. Well, Dan finally agreed after I asked him 10 times, so he finally gave in. So the day of the golf outing, Dan arrived at the golf course. I don't remember what country club we were playing, but as is the custom, the bag boys come out to your car to take your golf bag and put it in your golf cart. I was standing out in front waiting on Dan when he drove up. He opened up the trunk and the bag boy reached in and pulled out a golf bag that would have been popular probably in the 1930s. It was a very small carrying bag and it had a driver, about 3 irons, and a putter that looked like somebody had used it as a pickaxe. All the clubs were a little rusty and had a nice thick coating of dust and dirt. The bag strap was wired onto the clip. So I am not sure, but Dan had either dug this set of clubs out of the back of the barn or he had made a quick trip to the pawn shop. The bag boy looked at it, shrugged his shoulder, and went and put it on the golf cart. Now, Dan came over to me and I said that it was early and why don't we go over to the bar and have a beer? Well, he was all for that. I told him there were lockers for us if he wanted, and he said that he was ready to go as is. I said, okay. Now, we all know that Dan was never one to try to dress just to impress people. But I happened to look down, and I noticed Dan's shoes. I am not sure, but I think they might have been track shoes of some kind that he was wearing. Carol, you're going to have to tell me someday if Dan ever ran track, but they were definitely track shoes. So we got on the course, and I hit off the first tee, where both of us did. My ball went left in the trees. Dan's went right into the trees. Our putting game were no better, and I looked at the shaft on Dan's putter on the first green, and I swear it was bent a little to the left. Now, I won't say that Dan was frugal, but he would look forever for a lost golf ball. Once I got tired waiting and dropped one in the rough and told him I found his ball. It wasn't even close to the brand ball he was using, but he played it as if it was his own, no questions asked. So to sum up, after the third hole, we quit playing and just rode around the course drinking beer. I think the other twosome with us appreciated that since we were holding up the game somewhat. At the end of each hole, I would mark down a fictitious score for Dan and me. At the end of the day, there was a dinner, and then they were handing out golf prizes. Dan won the high gross prize. In other words, the prize for the worst score. I think it was a dozen golf balls, and he got to go up front and accept his prize. I have a picture of him getting that prize, and you would think he had won $1 million. That was probably one of my best days on the golf course I have ever spent. It was relaxed, and we had great conversation and a lot of fun. Carol, I would be interested to know if you find those golf clubs in the back of the garage. They are something to look at.
I never heard a word about that story.
He must have. He must have went to the pawn shop then. Another area of interest for Dan that you might not be aware of was adventure. And I just want to take a minute to talk about a couple of those trips that we had together. We were at a business meeting in Texas, and Dan wanted to see the Texas Speedway, which was about 45 minutes away, a NASCAR track. We drove out to the track. It was closed, but Dan found a way to sneak into the back of the grandstands. So the adventure begins. We were walking all around the place like we owned it. They finally found us on the top floor in the restricted VIP area. We were escorted out by a security guard who suggested that we not come back. Or when we were in a meeting in San Diego and Dan wanted to take the rental car to Tijuana to get a beer. Now, this was many years ago when it was fairly easy to cross the border into Mexico. Of course, the rental car agreement said in all caps, "Do not take the rental car into Mexico." I pointed this out to Dan and he said that it's okay. This is just some disclaimer stuff. You don't need to worry about it. So the adventure begins. We survived that trip and did bring the car back in one piece, but if you would have seen the bars he took me into in Tijuana, you would have guessed our chances were not good on getting back at all, or without at least getting robbed. Or when we were at a meeting in Washington, D.C. The meeting was over at around 5 p.m. And Dan decided that the hotels were too expensive in D.C. to stay another night. And we would just drive straight through home that night. Now, I knew this was not a good idea, and the weather looked like it was getting bad. But there was 4 of us in the car, so I thought splitting the drive between the 4 of us, the trip won't be too bad. So the adventure begins. It turned out that only 2 of us drove, and the other 2, one being Dan, were in the back of the car asleep and snoring the whole trip. Also, it poured rain the entire time. When we finally pulled into my driveway at the wee hours of the morning where everyone had parked their cars, Dan got out of the back of the car looking all refreshed. And following his normal dedicated work ethic, he asked me if I was going into the office because he wanted to call me a little later. Of course he was ready to go to the office. He had slept 8 or 9 hours. So I did call him in about an hour later, and he was in the office. Or when we went to San Antonio, and Dan wanted to go to the train museum. It was a Sunday, and we got there to find that they were closed. We were looking through the chain link fence. Dan was very interested. We were looking through a chain link fence at the trains and the cars and all the displays. And I looked over and I found Dan had pulled back the fencing from the post. So the adventure begins. He talked to me for 15 minutes about let's squeeze through the fence and go in and just look around, like that was a normal thing to do in a place like that. Somehow I talked him out of that adventure, a good thing too, because that would have been breaking and entering and a day in jail. Now, after saying all that, the outstanding thing that I always admired Dan for was his many years of service as a trustee on the Sheet Metal Workers Pension Fund and Hospitalization Fund. He was always looking out for what was best for the union membership that participated in these funds and how we could provide them the best benefits for the money that was being contributed to those funds. These funds are made up of equal numbers of labor and management trustees. Many times the other trustees, including myself, would get in the weeds and fussing about minor details, or we would let the labor management politics get in the way. Dan was a great one for bringing us back into focus as to what was important and the issues we needed to concentrate on. And man, he could read a financial report. He would ask questions and see things that I certainly got past me. He cared for the fund participants and he worked hard on their behalf. He stated more than once that he was not a labor trustee, he was not a management trustee. He made it clear that he was a fund trustee. He was able to look at the issues of running the funds in an unbiased way. Dan was simply an honest, nice, and I agree, fun guy that we all respected. I have used Dan as a sounding board over these years on many different issues. Doug Mays and I were talking about Dan earlier today, and I think Doug put it best. He was a good dude. I'll certainly miss him.
Thanks, Bob, but sounds like more than just Dan's smile was mischievous. Just something real brief, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for remarks. But as you were saying that, Dan loved a good deal, right? And I remember one day I was in the shop. It was pretty loud as it is, equipment, everything going, and I seen these stacks of boxes that were so water damaged, it looked like they came from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. I mean, they were ugly. You could hardly get packaging tape to stick to them. And Larry Hoover was across the shop a ways, and I said, "What's this?" And he broke up, but I heard him say, "Dan and free." I knew. I knew why we had them, and we needed to use them. So I've got a list of some things that Dan had interest in, and would like to open up. And I'll bring the microphone out if anybody has stories, anything you'd like to tell about Dan. If you just face this direction, you'll be caught on the camera. And again, try to keep it 3 to 5 minutes. But here's some of the things that I have on this list of interest for Dan. Saturday breakfast buddies at Lincoln Square, lunches at Kay's Hamburgers, genealogy research, involvement with the Miami County Park District, course historical interest, and the Optimist Club. So to allow enough time for us to continue after this and head downstairs after this is over, if you could try to keep it within that 3 to 5 minute range, we would appreciate it. Anybody have something they'd like to say? I see Mr. Hoover.
Thanks, Jim. Well, my name's Larry Hoover, and I worked for the Kerbers for 31 years. And if anybody ever rode with Dan in his stick shift car, I'm pretty fearless, but one of the most terrifying things I've ever been, the tightest I've ever worn my seatbelt, as he drank his coffee, smoked his cigar, crossed his legs, steered with his knee, and I don't know how the hell he ever shifted the car. I don't know what he did, but yeah, that was always good. And I don't know, my name is Larry Hoover. I introduced myself, but the guys in the shop don't even know my name because my name to Dan was Hoover. And when he yelled that, I knew something was up. So we always had a project going when he yelled my name. But it was a privilege to work for Dan. Very fair, and what a guy.
Thanks, Larry. Anybody else?
This won't take long. Dan.
Who are you?
Mom, my name is Alan. Number 10. The best looking one, too. Anyway, Dan, I remember, I'm like Fred. I had no idea he was in our family. He'd show up every once in a while. Didn't really know who he was. It's strange. We kind of had two families inside this big one. And I appreciate all my brothers and sisters, and Dan included. But I remember when I was out of work in 82, 81, I went to work for Dan at the beginning of Kerber Sheet Metal, his first couple years there. He was broke. I mean, he struggled to pay his bills. He struggled to get things going, and it was tough. I mean, he didn't pay me. He paid me 6 months later because he claimed he didn't have the money to pay me. I think he did, but he claimed he didn't. But he came back and paid his debt. One day he showed up and handed me a check. And it was when I was getting my business started as a distributor, and I needed that money. So kind of, if he'd have paid me when I earned it, I probably would have burned it. But Dan was very generous over the years, him and Carol. Dan is my godfather, my son's godfather, and somebody else, I think. Julie, not that Julie. But yes, oh, But Dan was very generous, very helpful. I was able to talk to him about finances, about my work, always ask about my jobs. I miss him. I miss him so.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Linda, the oldest of the two daughters, and I'm number 5. So I only have one thing to add to Alan's story. There was a period of time in our life that we were struggling financially, and Dan came and helped my son. And the thing that I remember is he said he was going to college, and the thing that I remember him said, "Don't tell anyone." And that was Dan's spirit of giving. And when Alan told me about when I heard for the first time about Alan's story, I thought he probably gave so many times that we didn't know about because he didn't want other people to know that he was giving. So, thank you. I hope he doesn't mind that I told now.
Feels good, doesn't it? Get one over on him.
Joseph, number 11. My story is pretty short. I was walking down the streets of Baltimore on my way to a food show, minding my own business. And about a half a block up, I saw somebody with a big white clump of hair. I said, "That's Kerber hair." And Carol and Dan were exiting the public library in Baltimore, where Dan was doing research in genealogy. And so I, being the guy that I am, I took the box of food that I was going to take to the convention center, put it on my shoulder, and walked right by him, turned around, and tapped him on the shoulder. He almost had a shorter life then, because that's that.
Thank you.
My name's Carl Barhorst. Dan and I go back a long, long time. I remember when Dan decided to go into the seminary. He was my classmate through the 8th grade. And I reacquainted myself with Dan. Dan and I, we ran around together as kids. And you mentioned about Dick Hooker and I and the adventures we would have on the river or fishing, or when Dick Hooker tried to drown me at Toowawa Park. I'm in the middle of the lake sleeping. He sinks the canoe, and I wake up under 15 foot of water playing Harry Houdini in my sleeping bag. But you know what? We laughed about those things. And I think a lot of those things really formed us. Dick, unfortunately, died at the age of 19, but I think his legacy goes on through people like Dan Kerber and myself. I moved to Troy in 1970, and Dan was part of the Southwest Historical District. And we got that thing going, and I was driving through today. I've been out of town for 35 years, but I was driving through town, and I saw a sign that says, "You're entering the historical district." And that was something it was a joke at the time, but real estate values went up, so we stopped laughing. But Dan always was a great person. Dan's parents were great people. The only Kerbers I knew were his parents and Bill and Dan. And all the rest of you, you had a good brother. You missed growing up with him, though. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
We'd just like to raise a hand. How many ate his honey? Come on, come on. Hey, on the way up here, we saw a truckload of bees. And we kept passing it, and then we come back, there's traffic. I thought, wow. I thought about all those bees. And our daughter, one of the nieces, she always got an extra little bit of honey, so don't tell anybody. But she loved Uncle Dan's honey.
If there's anybody else, I'll be glad to bring it out.
I'll just yell out one thing. sell his honey. And Dan said, I'm not going to sell my honey because then I'd have to figure out how much money I'm losing.
That makes sense.
When Dan told me one time he went into the seminary, I think I was like, wow, really? I can't quite picture that. And then he said, they promised me my own bed and I didn't have to share it with anybody.
Anybody else? I guess I'll just say, as somebody who has received a paycheck for the last 18 years from the Kerber family, thanks for not becoming a priest, Dan. Appreciate it. Is there anybody else? Okay, at this time, family members do wish to visit with you on the first floor as you move about with friends and enjoy refreshments. If you did not sign the guest book as you entered, you'll have the opportunity to do so before you leave. But before you head downstairs, we would like to go ahead and dismiss the family first. Thank you.